Welcome to the Zelos podcast, the show that's all about the pros behind the pros. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, Michol Dalcourt and Andrew Michol are joining me for a three-way conversation. I've had them on previous episodes separately, but this time we're getting together and we're going to talk all about a framework they're developing. Now, Andrew's with the Tampa Rays, while Michol, he's not only a Perform Better presenter, but he is the CEO and founder of the Institute of Motion. And we're going to get underway in just a moment. But before that, Andrew and I are actually going to be at the NSCA National Conference this week. That kicks off on Wednesday. You can join us at a 2-hour workshop all about open and closed chain foot mobilization. I'll be leading and he'll be helping me out. And then later on into the conference, make sure that you just, if you're going to be there, that you reach out. We'd love to connect, both him and myself. Also, Michol, at the same time, he's going to be in Long Beach, California at the Perform Better 3-Day Functional Summit. He's going to be talking about some amazing stuff, so you don't want to miss that if you're in the Southern California area. Now, speaking of Perform Better, this September 27th, I've got a one-day workshop happening back at their Functional Institute headquarters in West Warwick, Rhode Island. It's all about recalibrating movement from the ground up. Again, that's going to be September 27th, a one-day event. CEUs for sure will be doled out if you're in attendance. We'd love to have you there. If you can't make it, just go to my website, rockysnyder.com. If you need continuing education, I've got online courses, and there's other places I'll be in person teaching a whole bunch of different topics. And, you know, there's a thing that Andrew and I both have in common. We both have been going to Setanta College for a master's program. If you're interested in enrolling in Setanta, just put in the code RS10 and get 10% off tuition today with that code. Meanwhile, follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. Click the subscribe button and enjoy the conversation. All right. Well, we're just jumping right into this conversation. In fact, to be honest, we've been talking quite a while, and we just decided, you know what, we should hit the pause button and actually make this official. So I first want to welcome Andrew Michol with the Tampa Bay Rays back on the show. He has been a really important part of my educational process over the last year. I call him my accountability partner. It's been really great to get to know him outside of the podcast interview we had. So check out the archives if you want to check out what we talked about last time. And then Michol Dalcourt is here with me as well. Also has been on Zelos in the past. He and I are presenters for Perform Better. And Michol, with his omnidirectional approach to training and the products that he has been really enlightening to me, and as well as reinforcing my own particular professional philosophies when it comes to what the body needs. But I think, like what we've just been talking about, and now we're hitting the record button for everybody, is that we're talking beyond the physiological aspects of training and to really look at things in a much more complete manner, whether we use the word holistic or not. It's just physiologically, but psychologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, nutritionally, all those things. We're gonna jump right in. So how about you guys just kick it off and kind of repeat what it is. Andrew, how about you? Just talk to me and just repeat what it is you said before we hit the record button.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle and I have been meeting weekly for a couple months now. We've been kind of in touch for close to the last year, and um, the new problem we're looking to solve together is uh, holistic protocols for health, wellness, and performance, and not so much through the lens of, how do we make the tissue stronger? Because at the end of the day, that's what our big focus is like, how do we make all the tissue, even the tissue of the heart and the lungs, like how do we make that tissue stronger and more resilient? But what goes into that outside of the load protocols we might choose? What does it look like nutritionally? What does it look like in terms of sleep? What are all the things that play a role in the athlete or client's well-being that affect what choices we can even make once they enter the gym and pick up the load? And we've just been going on that journey for a while now, just trying to pick apart, what matters and what makes the most impact and what factors play a role and what can even become impactful, really kind of zooming out and looking at health and wellness in terms of like a large spider web that has a lot of pulls in all directions, as opposed to maybe these blocks that we need to just click into place.
Yeah, what's your take, Michelle? How do
Well,
you explain it?
yeah, one of the companies that we have is IOM, and we're an applied health and human performance company. And so what we look at is largely we look at frameworks as a beginning. Like, how do we anchor our mental models around something that is clear, that has a certain pedagogy to it, and then allows us to do something with it? And so if we look at the determinants of health and performance at a broad scale, and then we can certainly zero in. What we would look at would be on an individual level and a societal level. Let me park the social determinants of health just right now. Like there's societal elements that we can talk about, which I'm not going to really necessarily cover just yet. But on the individual side, we have determinants of health and performance. Some of them are genetics, some of them are family history, et cetera. Those are not actionable necessarily. So then the question is, which of these determinants of health on an individual level are most actionable? And it comes down to kind of key buckets: physical and some detail, mental, emotional, and some detail, and social and some detail, maybe economic. So social, economic, and some detail. And of those, what are the details? So physically, we can look at, movement that is structured, movement that is unstructured. We can look at recovery schemes. We can look at nutritional factors. These are all going to affect the physical elements of our body: the tissue, the organism, its function, its physiology. And so with that, we look at those facets as being important to the physical aspects. Then the same thing can be true with mental, emotional. We look at mental, the emotional regulation piece. So emotional health, what does that entail? Mental health, what does that entail? And so we can go and discover these things. What we look at, and then the same thing with the social bucket. What does social health and performance actually look like? When we think about relationships, social ability, social aptitude, each one of these facets in our mind are developable, right? And so if we look at a long-term development strategy as a global prospect, right, or a global kind of sense, what we would anchor into is each one of these facets can be developed. Now, what Andrew and I have been doing is diving deep into the physical bucket and the structure. How do we actually start to create different adaptations and supercompensations within the tissues of the body? But one can do that to any one of these buckets. We can go through and have a deep discussion on mental development and emotional development and how we develop from adolescence all the way to late life. Just like physically, we develop from adolescence all the way to late life. And so we start with these broad frameworks, Rocky, as a way to then dive deep into each one of these in a way that is structured, in a way that is, consistent and clear, that give us the pedagogy to be able to do something about it.
Man, that's first great. But also it's an octopus. I mean, it is a juggernaut. What you're talking about, at least in my mind, I'm thinking of it being whether it's the individual is the hub of the wheel, and you've got these tremendous number of spokes emanating outward, and they're going to be individually dependent on so many different factors. Like, have you started to wrap your head around like an approach to take that would really bring into consideration all of which you've already mentioned here? I mean, I know Gray and Lee have their app that's out there now, and they're attempting to look at diet, they're looking at sleep, they're looking at energy level and workout frequency and so on. But I think you're talking more in depth. At least it appears to me that you're really going deeper. And so how are you guys talking about that? Like, ho what are you working like,
Yeah.
how is it yeah, how are you deciphering this code?
Oh,
It's
well,
it's actually very difficult, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not only an octopus, Rocky, but it's a bidirectional codependent scenario. So biology is bidirectional, meaning if I do something physically, it can affect my mental health and vice versa. So how, if we're gonna reveal these tenets as being the domains of a person's health and human performance, it can be seen as infinitely complex. So at some point, we're going to need mental models to be able to try to simplify the complexity. in order to organize our thought and organize our actions and approaches so that it's somewhat scalable and somewhat consistent across disciplines. So it sounds complex, and we've simplified it. There are basically three buckets with four elements within each bucket. And we develop these adjacent to each other in a way that is commensurate with like long-term athletic development, which is always seen. LTAD models have always been seen just through the physical lens, which I think is awesome, and they've done an incredibly good job. We've piggybacked off of that and said, all right, let's follow the same structure, but instead of just physical development, let's talk about these other determinants of health: social, emotional, mental. How do we develop that and use a similar framing that LTAD has used for years? And what it's done is it's simplified our approach to be able to develop this over the life stages in a way that is consistent, clear, and has measurable outcomes associated with it.
Andrew, what's your
I
take?
mean, our meetings typically start and end with the whiteboard in my office getting filled up and then erased, and then filled up and then erased. And then, in our time with Setanta at Rocky, we've had access to a lot of research databases, which have been good for me and Michol's conversations, because I'm just combing through research weekly and I'm just throwing it all on the whiteboard as like discussed with Michol later. And he's right. Like, we're putting a metabolic box, a regeneration box, a neuromechanical movement box. And, the meeting starts. I'm like, all right, Michol, which ones have lines that connect them? Which ones have no meaning here and we should erase them? And what ends up happening more often than not is that all of them are interconnected. And we sit there and we go, great. So we spend an hour talking about how everything affects everything, which makes it difficult to decide like which one matters the most. But then we start combing through like, okay, if this quadrant is taken care of, if the person's regen is in a good spot, what do they have access to in the nutrition and neuromechanical box? What do they have access to in the metabolic box? And vice versa. If the movement's going well, what should we look to highlight in the other quadrants and compartments that Michol and his team at IOM and Viper have done a good job of creating and building frameworks for? And so it is like an ever evolving question. And I don't know if we've ever really stuck on one answer, but we have learned that it's not binary at all. You don't like succeed or don't succeed. You essentially like almost just take these dimmer switches and you crank some up and crank some down, kind of like a massive, DJ booth for your life. And we're trying to uncover like what those buttons actually are. And in terms of connective tissue, Michol's done a lot of groundwork already in his career that's been super beneficial. And now we're just taking that same lens and seeing like how it connects to all the other possible buttons on that.
Wow. Yeah. That's what size is your whiteboard? It's got to be the size of your garage or something, because that's a lot of stuff to put on there.
I have two in the office. And I share this office with 3 other coaches. And I do have to give them the notice once or twice a week, like, please don't erase anything on this board. Or, occasionally I'll carve out some space for them in the corner. I'm like, anything you need for the team, let's put it over here in this corner. But I need all this space. So my teammates with the Rays have been really, really great and patient with me as I have a weekly brainstorm session.
And so where is this leading? Like, where the whiteboard sessions, I know to some degree, but like, what's becoming solidified, do you feel? You mentioned buckets. Go ahead.
So maybe we can give a tangible example of what Andrew is referring to here, just for the listener. So we're working on frameworks, and what's the value of a framework, right? So, unfortunately, Andrew's not in front of a whiteboard right now because he could draw it out. But in your mind's eye, I want you to take, basically a line, a continuum that goes up and down. So we'll call that the y-axis. So in your mind's eye, there's a continuum that goes from top to bottom. And in your mind's eye, there's one continuum that goes left to right. And they overlap we'll we'll do the metabolic one. They overlap so that they look like a cross. So everybody can visualize a cross in your head, right? So Rocky, let's assume that the line going up and down the y-axis is intensity, right? So on the bottom of that line, you put kind of low intensity, we're going to call it sub-maximal intensity somewhere, right? You're sub-maximal down here. And if that's a continuum and I go straight up, you're going and ever increasing your intensity. And at the top of that line, we'll put high intensity, right? So you got a line that goes from high intensity to somewhere near sub-maximal, eventually low, but sub-maximal intensity. That's a continuum, right? Now, if you overlap that with an x-axis that goes left to right, and on the left-hand side, you have steady state, right? So you're, okay, steady state. The opposite of steady state, if that's a continuum, is not the same. It's going to undulate up and down. We're going to call that interval, right? So now
Sure.
you've got 4 orientations. You have high intensity on top, submaximal on the bottom. On the left, you have steady state, and on the right, you have interval. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, completely.
Well, if you're a cross, you have 4 quadrants, right? You've got a top 2 and a bottom 2. Now, if you actually look at the acronyms, like we work with a lot with the military now, and everything's an acronym for them. But let's look at these acronyms. Like if I go to the bottom left quadrant, Rocky, right? So in your mind's eye, bottom left. So I'm sub-maximal, and I'm on the left, which means steady state. So we're going to call that, for our purposes, sub-maximal intensity steady state. Sub-maximal intensity steady state, SIS, right? SISS. And we might say, Rocky, what is sub-maximal and steady state? And by steady state, we mean your physiology is in the same relative state, and it's not really changing that much. Could be in a high state, could be in a medium state, could be a low state, but it ain't changing. It's steady state. But if I'm doing some sort of sub-maximal intensity, and it's, just kind of hovering at the same state, we're going to call that, let's say, zone 1, zone 2, or zone 3 cardio, right? And so it's some sort of aerobic exercise, if we're thinking metabolic, which we are. And that metabolic effort is sustained at a lower intensity, and it's just consistent all the way through. Now, we might say, all right, what are the benefits of that? And we'll go through a laundry list of these things like, better cardiac output, better aerobic efficiency, better stroke volume in time, better hemoglobin and myoglobin concentrations, AMPK, PGC1 alpha expression, which is just basically aerobic expressions, and better mitochondrial biogenesis, which is better longevity. So we can kind of make this physiological argument that doing cardio is of some benefit to the body. And there's a whole litany of research that would back that up. Cool.
Sure.
So we got a quadrant for that, right? And this is what Andrew's point is that, okay, we've got a representation there, boom. If we go across to the other bottom quadrant, you're still sub-threshold intensity. You're lower intensity. So sub-threshold intensity, but now you're interval. So now what I'm telling you is, Rocky, give me an example of how you're still not high intensity. You're still sub-threshold. You're still aerobic, but instead of steady state, you're kind of going up and down and up and down and up and down with that lower intensity in mind. And you might say, well, that sounds a lot like activities of daily life, right? Or, maybe some sort of a gym circuit that's kind of lower intensity. Yeah. And
I was thinking the average workday.
Yeah. And chores around your yard, right? So if we take a claim as to the benefits, the health and performance benefits of moving throughout the day, that's what the ACSM says as movement snacks. Like you're better healthy and you're more effective in your metabolic, abilities if you move, somewhat intermittently throughout the day. It's when you're idle for long periods of time that health begins to decay. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, all these things, these indices of disease start to go up. So we've got a quadrant for that, the bottom quadrant on the right-hand side, right? So now that's SIT, S-I-I-T, subthreshold intensity interval. Cool. If we go straight up from there, right? So now we're in the top right. Now we're high intensity interval training. That's HIIT training. Now, Andrew and I would make the argument that most people say they're doing HIIT in the gym, but they're really not.
Yeah.
There's certainly high intensity enough, but what they sacrifice, Rocky, is the recovery, right? So what they're doing is just saying as many rounds as possible, or every minute on the minute, or every 30 on the 30, or ASAP, like I want to get it done as fast as I can. That's fantastic, but you're sacrificing recovery. So a good track coach or a good Olympic weightlifting coach would take a look at the recovery and see it being shrunk and say, that's no good. Because when you're sacrificing recovery, you're not reconstituting metabolic energy substrate. So your substrate is being dwindled. Your neural fatigue is being accumulated and you can't get rid of it. And your water, your fluid, interstitial fluid, is not being reconstituted because you don't have enough recovery. So true HIIT training would be like a good track coach or a good Olympic weightlifting coach that gets their individual to do something for 10, 15 seconds and then does nothing for the next 5 minutes, dead air. And what they're doing is they're reconstituting everything so they can reach critical power again and again in repeat bouts over time. So the work-rest ratio of HIIT training needs to be like 1 to 4, 1 to 6, depending on, metabolic versus neural fatigue.
Instead of 3 to 1.
Instead of the opposite, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
gonna do 30 seconds and take 10 seconds recovery. Like
Right.
that. So that's not HIIT training. So everybody calling it HIIT, but they're not doing HIIT. So that's true HIIT training. So the last quadrant, Rocky, is zoom across with the upper left.
High intensity, steady state. So HISS.
HISS. So HISS training is exactly what you just said. HISS training is the CrossFits. HISS training is your AMRAPs and your EMOMs and your high rocks, and that's HISS. That's what the fitness industry is in love with right now, is HISS.
Yeah.
We got a quadrant for it. Now, there's some detriment to that too. If you do too much of it, there's some decay and some autophagy and some negative effects of physiology because your dose response might be too high. But here's the bottom line of what we're getting at. We have a 4-quadrant model, right? All those quadrants we just said. Anything that you can do in any realm of intensity, either undulating or not, is represented somewhere in this grid, somewhere. Now, if we said, hey, your data points are going to be in whatever quadrant, over time, I can see exactly what signature that you're expressing metabolically, and I can tell you what adaptive processes you might ladder up to, or what interferences you might be throwing into the mix. And it clarifies what you're doing, where you're spending your time, what adaptations you might get in time, but it also cuts through the noise of dogma and ideology. Because no longer are we throwing grenades at each other because you're a cardio guy and I'm a high intensity guy and you're wrong. None of that exists anymore because each one of these quadrants has benefit. The question is, what benefit do you want? How much is the minimal dose response? And what interference exists between them? And by the way, interference is not necessarily bad. What interference exists, because if I touch on each one of these quadrants over time and I develop some degree of adaptation, I get what's called metabolic flexibility. And that is a hallmark of health and performance. So that's what we're talking about when Andrew and I say we have these mental models that inform how we make decisions and how we justify those decisions. And by the way, it cuts through the noise of complexity real quick. Metabolic pathways are infinitely complex and they infinitely commingle. How do we make sense of it? That's our attempt to make sense of it.
And that's really well done and explaining it to me, because that really lays it out. One, it discourages subjective opinions. So, just as you say,
ideological and dogmatic approaches. You got it.
there you go. And yet right now, we're only talking about intensity and frequency. We're talking about rest, recovery, workload, and so on. But I see, you just gave me a 2-dimensional object, which is great. But I also see a hypercube. I see, obviously, you didn't throw in the z-axis, but I could see there being a z-axis. I could see there being many axes coming through. And then to put to live in a 3-dimensional world and to try and construct something that is multidimensional beyond that, this is where you guys, that whiteboard starts to get filled up. That's my imagination, maybe.
And Rocky, you're absolutely right. There is a z-axis, and there is like infinite complexity that like anyone can take these models. And I think what Michol and I always come back to is that sports performance, private sector, collegiate, high school, whatever, the common mistake people tend to make is that they go for the complexity first. Everyone's like, what am I missing? Everyone's like, what's the secret that I haven't like figured out yet. And what these models do is they help, especially when you plot out your workouts like in those boxes, and you're like, oh, like I've been in the top right, hit for 6 weeks now. I have all these different workouts and I have all these different plans, but they're actually all the same thing, just scaled differently. It kind of pulls the curtain back and helps people realize like, oh, I'm actually not this complex athlete. I think I am. I behave and speak as if I am, but the actual like outputs I go through on a daily basis don't give the impression of flexibility or complexity. They actually do the exact opposite. And so with these models, we're able to, one, like catch ourselves. We can put what we're talking about on these models and realize, oh, our programming is kind of redundant, or this idea that we're stuck on is kind of stuck in the bottom left. What can we do to stretch it to the other three quadrants? And I see the difference here even when I talk to athletes, and I'm like, you've been doing high speed. There are benefits to your speed training if we actually go the opposite direction. Let me show you how. And I'll literally put the quadrant up on the board for an athlete, and I'll walk them through how these things all differ and why they're experiencing or feeling the responses they are. But it just helps simplify everything, because people jump to complexity way too quick.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. In fact, when I get the paralysis through analysis, it's just a sign that I need to go back to the basics. And in regards to movement or whatever, when I'm finding myself get overwhelmed, it's because I'm making things more complex than they need to be. And what are the basic fundamentals? What are the pillars that I need to be focused on? So as you guys are talking, I'm also now in my mind, I've got a Rubik's cube, because I have this feeling that, well, you just took um, intensity and frequency, shall we say, but now you could do the same thing with other elements of not only strength conditioning, but the elements of human existence and life. Right now we've got this X and Y for sleep patterns, or for nutrition and digestion, for psychological stress, rest, digest, fight, flight. I could just see these things creating more and more quadrants. Like, how far down the rabbit's hole are you guys going?
So great question. So again, we always look for frameworks to distill simplicity out of the complexity, right? So to your point, Rocky, and it's well said, because it can get complex pretty quick. So the z-axis, I'm Canadian, so I always think z-axis, but the z-axis initially would be your acute variables, right? So if you're the Rubik's Cube, you take intensity and you take physiological state, right? There's either an interval or undulating state or steady state. We'll call that. And then the axis going out towards you is the art of program design. It is the recipe that you put to intensity and to physiological state to derive whatever outcome you want, right? So that's the z-axis. It's your sets and reps and your exposure. So that's the kind of the where we go. Now, is there other complexities to this Rubik's Cube? 100%. But again, that's where we start. That's where you're going to, at least in our minds, you're going to land, 96, 97, 98% of what you want within those elements. And it's simple enough to use. So we've got a metabolic four quadrant, which we just described to you, right? Which is metabolic substrates, the pathways that are involved in metabolism and energy, the deriving of energy. These things are important. We've simplified it. Four quadrants, you exist somewhere in those quadrants all the time. What do you want? We've also done the same for what we call neuromechanical, and Andrew touched on this earlier, and one for recovery. So the neuromechanical one is basically a fancy way of saying, how do you move and how do you load the body? And it doesn't look like a cross, it looks like a plus sign. So it's equal geometric space in every quadrant, right? And we talk about load, right? Either body weight or external load. And then we talk about linear patterns versus multi-directional patterns. And the reason why we do is we feel very strongly that there are benefits to linear patterns And there's benefits to multi-directional patterns. You don't have to choose a side. There's not a camp that you need to ascribe to. The body takes those inputs in and ladders up, if there's a right recovery, ladders up to an adaptation response over time. And if there's no additional inputs, then there's, involution, which is, kind of the detraining effect or the residual training effects that hold and then decay after time. But what are we putting in the body in terms of mechanical load and movement? And we can play that game from a strength perspective. We can play it from a power perspective. We can play it from a joint mobility perspective. And as Andrew said before, we can take a look at the cardiac elements, the cardiac muscle, and that apparatus, and we can take a look at the adaptive process from that perspective. And we can all lens it through our 4Q neuromechanical model, and you take the complexity and you start making sense of it. And it's a way to scale. And then we have the same thing with recovery. Like, how do you take light and temperature and vibration and oxygen, and how do you take all these elements and you categorize it and inventory it in a library that you can actually now prescribe and give to an individual in a work-in day, so that they can actually get towards homeostasis from an allostatic, state. So that's some of the, these models allow us to do that.
I think I'm getting the sense of it. And honestly, it would be like, in my mind, there's a sheet of paper for, let's just take one of Andrew's athletes, name at the top, and you have the different facets or elements that you've just described. And beside them, there are 4 boxes. Those each represent one of the quadrants. And you go down and you are basically, this is an assessment sheet. Where are they residing out of these 4 quadrants for this element, and so on down the road? Maybe they're in 2 quadrants, maybe they're in 3 out of 4, maybe they're only residing in 1, but you're getting a fingerprint of this individual and how they're existing and what their activity level is like and recovery and all that. And that just gives you, like you say, framework and understanding of where they are with all of these aspects. That's like visually informative and appealing. So then now you can go, okay, let's give them this experience over at this quadrant, because they haven't been visiting there. They think they're traveling the world, but actually they've been living in their backyard the entire time, unaware that there's so much out there. Am I on the right track with this?
Yeah, Rocky, you're nailing it right on the head. And what kind of inspired us to go down this path was, I was reading research on tendons and extracellular matrix, and I just wanted to understand it more, because obviously working in the world of baseball, like, soft tissue injuries are unfortunately like way too common. And they unfortunately continue to happen to the same part of the body, the shoulder and the arm. And so I was wondering, I was like, okay, it's not like we don't know the research. So, like, what is in the research that maybe we need to pick out a little bit more? And I kept seeing this thing mentioned about site-specific adaptations. So literally, the tendon will not have a uniform adaptation to the stimulus you're providing. There are some movements, speeds, and loads that will cause adaptations at distal attachment sites. There are movements that cause adaptations at proximal attachment sites. And I was reading research that there are humans that they've studied with tendons that kind of have like that hourglass shape, where they're just so far on either end of the spectrum that actually the middle of the tendon is atrophied, and you just have these really strong ends, which obviously create this overly stiff tendon, which now is leading to muscular strains. Or vice versa, you can have people that train muscle too much, and now you have this massive musculotendinous junction that just rips the tendon right off the bone. And I was asking Michol, what can we do about this? Because if we have athletes that move fast, I can't train them not to move fast. I can't take them into the gym and try to train them heavy and slow, right? And Michol and I together have kind of peeled apart that question and realized, the old adage of like, expose them to what will happen in game, sport specific training. There's a little more nuance to that than originally believed, because you do have to expose the tissue to other demands so that you can have a more holistically healthy tissue. Think of the tissue as its own individual being and person and organism. You wouldn't want it to only ever be exposed to hot or only ever be exposed to cold. You would want it to have flexibility and dynamism through all these different environments. And so once we started understanding that, we really started going through all these quadrants and building out like, what does holistic training look like? And we were really in on the movement piece. And then we started talking about, okay, what about when these athletes travel? Or what about when our clients travel? You know, like I used to work in the private sector, you do too now. Like you have someone who goes on a red eye. It's not just them sitting down for a long time that creates stiffness. It's what they eat, it's what they drink, it's how their sleep is disrupted. You know, I was texting you about learning that our tissues have their own individual circadian rhythms that can be disrupted. And that's something that blew my mind.
That was cool. That was
Yeah,
definitely gave
these
pause.
these rabbit holes we find ourselves in, and when we do dig ourselves back out of them, we don't just stay in them. But we're learning that there's so much more nuance to health and performance coaching and health and performance training. And so now it's just a matter of, okay, how do we take something that's infinitely complex and make it really simple so that when we teach coaches these programs, or we teach coaches these frameworks, they don't leave that lesson thinking, well, I can't do anything, I'm frozen. They think, okay, I actually have all these options to choose from. It's a much different way to think about going about your choices.
I love it. No, I can totally relate. I mean, just trying to simplify progression and regression. I use three levels. You're either getting some assistance, you're doing it without any assistance, and now you have resistance or external load, right? Those are just not that it's a red, yellow, or green light, but there's some movements that people can't handle with their own body weight, and they need some help. They need some guidance. They need some external assistance. And then once they get proficient in that motion, then we can reduce the amount of help until they're free to do it on their own. They've got the motor control, mobility, coordination, balance, and so on. And then now that they're proficient in that, now let's challenge them even deeper to that. So like I get where you're going, and I'm obviously really digging it. I think that you guys are really on a great path here, and I could see some amazing potential for really getting this to be, um, I won't say fine tuned, but easily accessible and reproducible and repeatable and teachable. Like if it can be teachable to the masses, whether it's private or professional sectors or whatever. Like I like where this is going. Where, Michelle, where do you want it to go?
Well, certainly our lens is, very many facets of health and human performance. So if we think about healthcare and we think about it from a non-clinical, non-medical perspective, like what does that mean to the individual when they build health assets? That's your regular client or patient in in society writ large, right? How do they gain the benefits of this sensibility in a way that they don't have to become experts in? So we built a technology where it's visualized, right? You've got heat signatures relative to where your quadrants are in our 4Q models. We anchor our models to a algorithm, and that algorithm powers some of our technology. We're in the midst of writing a SaaS technology that plugs into any ecosystem that does the same thing. But what we want to do is apply health and human performance. We feel very strongly that some of our logic models are really good algorithms. And we use these algorithms to kind of simplify the complexity. So that would be one. So we've created these heat signatures in the domains of movement, metabolic health, recovery, et cetera. And so largely what people can do now is interact in a way and anchor to a model or a series of models that are kind of simple, and they can inform what I'm going to do, when I'm going to do it, et cetera. Like, think about it this way. The neuromechanical 4Q, Rocky, we would describe to the average person on the street as, these are all your movement vitamins. You can take a certain amount, you can actually over-index on one quadrant, it's totally fine. But if you're missing certain vitamins from a movement perspective, you could be at risk. Maybe you're not as unbreakable as you thought, or maybe you're just missing the adaptive process in a certain way that's going to expose risk of injury or limit your performance in some capacity. So it is a way to describe in very simple terms that can be easily understood why these models and what it does for you. And so, that's where we spend a lot of time. We are in the fitness, performance, and general health space. And all of these things have relevance. And we want to bring that to the sensibilities of folks, not necessarily by teaching them these models, but maybe having these models be the algorithm that they can interact with so that it can start to nudge them in the right directions as it relates to a recommendation engine that can power their programming for health and performance.
And you're doing this through IOM?
Correct, through IOM. Yeah. And so
And
we've done large public health initiatives with governments. We've done performance and fitness, projects over the years, but this is through IOM.
what are the biggest hurdles that you guys are coming up against?
What are the biggest hurdles?
Public reluctance, administrative, kind of like red tape. What's, if there's anything slowing the progress down?
I think what it is more than anything else, it's a great question. There is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest to the conversations we're having. I think what's interesting about your question is what I would anchor it to is it's this idea of business inertia versus planned obsolescence. And what I mean by that is if the three of us are in a business, a widget company, how we've done business is kind of how we do business. And the inertia of how we've done things in the past just kind of carry us through. Unless we take a very mindful approach to planned obsolescence, meaning we're going to plan to sunset certain aspects of our business on purpose so that we can sunrise new ones. And that would be an innovative growth mindset.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't take that. It's just we kind of do things the way we do things. We call that business inertia. Like it just takes you through, and the inertia of how we've done in the past just carries us forward. The companies and the organizations and the entities that do it well practice planned obsolescence. They practice like, what do we need to sunset in our business right now? Because it ain't serving us anymore. And we're going to sunset it. We're going to close the doors. Like it's the Blockbuster video. We're going to close our doors and start Netflix. Like it's that sort of mentality. But if we think we're all about the plastic boxes on the shelves and people will come in to rewind the videos and that's our business, that's just business inertia. And innovative companies will actually plan to sunset things that are not working so that they can sunrise new ones. And I think largely, I don't know if we're up against that, but that's always I think the creative tension or the business tension of things. Like how do we pull on this enough to get them to move forward without pulling too much that they're resistant to move forward? And it's always that tension.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that as your response or your answer, but it makes complete sense. I mean, we're talking about human fear. We're talking about the question of somebody's existence in a way. And with if there are, I won't say closed-minded, but if they have the blinders on and this is all they know and they've been going through this, and you're offering something that could threaten their progress because of its efficacy or success, I could see how that could slow things down. Just pharmaceutical companies, they rely on profits from the manufacturer of what they're doling out, rather than looking at how can we reduce the amount of prescriptions out there and build a healthier population. Like I see that as a great example of planned obsolescence that's not happening. So to go into this environment with that newer way of thinking is, one, refreshing, but also very interesting to see how others will respond to it. So I don't know. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Rocky, we're about to see this live and in person next week in Kansas City. Like we're going to an SCA national conference, and these conferences are a great opportunity to network, attend presentations, and what you want, what you imagine, like the idealistic world, is that people will attend the things they don't understand. Like they'll go towards the title presentations that maybe like catch their eye because that's a concept I haven't heard before. That's something I don't think I'm familiar with. But what happens more often than not is that people go to the presentations they're comfortable in. They would feel safe answering those questions. They would feel safe watching, that demonstration, doing that hands-on activity. So, but at the same time, they'll go back to their gym and they'll view it as like an unlock, like, oh, I just thought of a new way to think of speed, or I just thought of a new way to think of strength. Um, what we're hoping people look to do is maybe look at a new way to do programming, a new way to do like health coaching. Um, I think the idea of health coaches in the sport performance space has kind of been like taboo. Like a health coach seems like much more of a private sector deal, whereas a sport performance coach, I mean, that's someone who like really gets after it and like makes someone run fast and lift heavy. We want people to see that the things that happen in the private sector that are more like holistic wellness based would have huge benefits in the sports performance sector, and vice versa. The things that make people run really fast and lift really heavy weights and perform on the Olympic stage, there are people that will never perform in the Olympics that could absolutely benefit from a little bit more speed and a little bit more power. So opening up, it sounds ambitious, but opening up like the industry's eyes to, the way you've done things like is able to be changed. Um, that's one of my goals, and that's what like draws me to working with Michol and being part of any project he's going to be a part of.
That's fantastic. I will give kudos to the NSCA's current leadership, because it seems to be that there is more likelihood that what you just mentioned can actually occur compared to previous years. And being a
Right.
member now for over 30 years, it's very exciting for me to see what might take place. And just quickly back to your framework, to kind of just look at it from my perspective. I I love this concept. I appreciate what you guys have just explained, because if I go back to that assessment sheet with that athlete with all the quadrants laid out and seeing where they are, it's not just an assessment for the athlete, but it's a mirror for myself to look at
Checks and
what
balances.
where yeah where do I hover, where are my comfort zones, where am I not wanting, or maybe for lack of knowledge or experience or just awareness, it just brings it right in front of me and go, oh, we haven't been going to this quadrant or that quadrant, and that's
And it could
something to
be
look at.
confirmation too, Rocky, right? So it could be like
True.
I've plotted it out and there's a bias towards this one quadrant, and it should be. I'm in a certain phase of my microcycle or mesocycle, and I want to index high on this adaptation. Therefore, the exposure needs to be whatever it needs to be. It just confirmed it is a way to visualize inputs. And as you know, inputs in biology, if they're if they're modulated right, and you recover from them, that leads to supercompensation. That is the adaptive process, is inputs to outputs, right? And
Yeah.
it's a way to look at that with cold eyes in some sense.
Fantastic. Okay. IOM, Institute of Motion.
Correct. Yeah.
How do people
instituteofmotion.com.
look more into?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Instituteofmotion.com. They can go to vipr.com. You can take a look at what we've done. And Andrew and I have an ambition to try to get on more discussions and have this narrative in two things, in a substantive way and a respectful way. We're not interested in throwing
Yeah.
grenades at some ideology. It's like that biology doesn't look at it that way. It's too complex, it's too redundant, it's too bidirectional. It can get the job done in a variety of different ways. A lot of times when I hear dialogue, I'm like, you're right and you're right. And they're like, well, how's that true? It's like biology makes it true, because these redundancies can create, multiple paths to the end goal. And so that's what we're interested in. We're interested in having meaningful, substantive, and respectful discussions on what are we looking at? How do we simplify it when appropriate? And how do we take the multitude of different facets of human biology and consider them within reason, so that we can create unbreakable individuals?
That's perfect. And that's a great segue to say that if you want to have conversations, then this week in Kansas City, Missouri at the NSCA National Conference, just grab myself, Andrew, both of us, because we're going to be there. And then meanwhile, if you're at the Long Beach Perform Better Functional Summit this week, That's where Michol's going to be. So hopefully you're heading in one of those directions, and we'd love to see you at either. Andrew, Michol, guys, I can't thank you enough. This was really an awesome conversation. I feel inspired. I feel educated at the same time, and I really want to thank you both.
We appreciate the
Rocky. This
opportunity
was
to
great.
share. Yeah, thank you.
I know you're thinking time flies when it's a good conversation, and this one whipped by. Thank you, Michol and Andrew, for coming on. And remember, if you want to connect with Andrew and myself this week, join us in Kansas City. Hopefully you're going to be there at the NSCA National Conference. Go to nsca.com, find out more information. Last minute, but you can still make it. Or if you're on the West Coast, join Michol in Long Beach at the Conference Center there for Perform Better's 3-day functional summit. Go to performbetter.com, and while you're there, sign up for my course, my 1-day workshop, Recalibrating Movement from the Ground Up, all about closed chain biomechanics, understanding how the foot plays in with the rest of the body through human movement, assessment, and more. Check out my website, rockysnyder.com. I've said enough. Just go to Setanta College for more information on master's programs. Check out my book, Return to Center, and we'll see you next week.